Abraham Lincoln. I mean, we all know the name, right? The face on the penny, the giant memorials. But who was the man behind the legend? What was it really like to lead a nation that was literally tearing itself in two? How on earth did he handle the single greatest crisis in American history? Well, that's what we're going to dive into.
So get this. Years before he's even president, Lincoln drops this line that just cuts right to the heart of the matter. A house divided against itself cannot stand. And, he wasn't talking about some minor political squabble. No, he was talking about an existential threat. The idea that a nation could survive being half slave and half free, he saw it as a path to total self-destruction. And that one idea, it became the bedrock of his entire political career.
Okay, so how does a guy born in a log cabin, mostly self-taught, end up at the absolute center of this national firestorm? Well, his path to the presidency was, let's just say, anything but a straight line.
I mean, if you look at his early resume, you wouldn't necessarily peg him for greatness, right? A prairie lawyer, a stint in the state legislature, one single term in Congress. But then 1854 happens, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act, it just changes everything. This law basically threatened to open up the West to slavery, and for Lincoln, this was a line in the sand. It was a moral breaking point that yanked him right back into the national political fight.
And the big idea behind this act was something called popular sovereignty. On the surface, it sounds pretty democratic, doesn't it? Just let the settlers in each new territory vote on it themselves. But Lincoln's rival, Stephen A. Douglas, was pushing this, and what it really did was crack open the door for slavery to expand everywhere. For Lincoln, this wasn't democracy at all. It was a complete betrayal of what the country was supposed to stand for.
So here's the fundamental clash, laid out plain and simple. You've got the brand new Republican Party, with Lincoln becoming one of its main voices. Their stance was firm. Slavery stops here. No expansion. Period. They weren't calling for total abolition just yet, but they were determined to contain it. Then you have Douglas pushing his let the locals decide idea. This massive disagreement is what led to those legendary Lincoln-Douglas debates, the thing that really put Lincoln on the national map. And wow, his rise was just meteoric from there. By 1860, he's the Republican nominee for president. And then he wins. The catch? He won without a single Southern state voting for him. For the South, this was an absolute disaster. It was the final straw, proof that their power in the Union was gone. And just like that, the crisis exploded. So now Lincoln has to take office, and the country is literally falling apart around him. He tries to calm things down, In his first big speech as president, he's practically pleading for unity. He even promises he won't touch slavery in the states where it's already legal. But honestly, the time for talking was over. It was already way too late. Just think about the scale of this thing. It's staggering. 7 states are already gone before he even takes the oath of office. Then, the shooting starts at Fort Sumter, and the war is on. Lincoln has to make some really tough calls, stretching presidential power like never before. I mean, he suspends habeas corpus. That's the basic right that says you can't be thrown in jail for no reason. And all the while, he's getting attacked from all sides politically. It's just an impossible situation. And if all that political chaos wasn't enough, he had another huge problem. He couldn't find a general who would actually, fight. He got so frustrated with guys like General George McClellan. McClellan was a genius at organizing the army, but he was just painfully slow and cautious, always afraid to actually go after Robert E. Lee. Lincoln was desperate for a commander with some real grit, and finding that person was one of the biggest headaches of the early war. All right, this brings us to a really crucial turning point. The war isn't going so well for the Union, and the casualty lists are just getting longer and longer. All this sacrifice, it needed to be for something more. And this is where Lincoln starts this slow, careful process of changing the very meaning of the war. At first, his public message was laser-focused, and for good reason. Politically, he had to keep the country together. He famously said in 1862 that his #1 goal was to save the Union, not to end slavery. He said he'd free all the slaves, or none of them, or some of them, whatever it took to keep the nation in one piece. But even as he's writing that, you can tell his own thinking is starting to change. And then, Antietam, September 1862. Just a horrific, bloody day, one of the worst in American history. But, and this is the key part, it was a Union victory. It was just enough of a win to stop Lee's invasion of the North.
And it gave Lincoln the opening he had been waiting for. It gave him the political cover to do something truly revolutionary. And listen to this quote from him. "I never in my life felt more certain that I was doing right than I do in signing this paper." I mean, what a change. Just months after saying his main goal wasn't slavery, he's now speaking with total moral clarity. He'd found that higher purpose for the war, and he was all in. You know, the Emancipation Proclamation was a brilliant move on so many levels. It was both a moral statement and a savvy military strategy. See, by freeing slaves only in the states that were in rebellion, it became a weapon. It undermined the South's economy. And, this is huge, it officially allowed black men to join the Union Army. It completely transformed the fight into a war for freedom. Then, just a few months later, he's at the dedication of the Battlefield Cemetery at Gettysburg, and he gives what might be the most famous speech in American history. It's incredibly short, less than 3 minutes. But in those few words, he connects all that terrible sacrifice on the battlefield directly back to the founding ideals of the nation and this idea of a new birth of freedom. He made it clear that those soldiers did not die for nothing. So when you look at it, you can really see his strategy to end slavery taking place in 3 distinct steps. It wasn't just one big declaration. Step 1, the Emancipation Proclamation, a military move. Step 2, the Gettysburg Address, which gave the war its moral purpose. And the final step, the one that made it permanent, the 13th Amendment, which banned slavery across the entire country, for good. Okay, so the Union has won. The war is finally ending. But Lincoln's mind is already on the next, and maybe even harder, challenge. It wasn't about winning the war anymore. It was about winning the peace. How do you possibly put a country this broken back together again? His second inaugural address, given just weeks before it was all over, is just incredible. There's no gloating, no "we won" kind of talk. Instead, it's this incredibly humble, almost spiritual plea for reconciliation. With malice toward none, with charity for all. His whole focus was on healing, on binding up the nation's wounds, not on revenge. So the war is over. General Lee surrenders. People are celebrating in the streets. The nightmare is finally done, and now the real work of healing can start. But just 5 days later, everything changes. On April 14, 1865, at Ford's Theater, Lincoln is shot by John Wilkes Booth. He dies the next morning. The one man who had somehow steered the nation through 4 years of absolute hell was gone, right at the moment of victory. And just like that, the country was thrown from celebration right back into shock and mourning. So when we ask why Lincoln matters, the answer is just immense. First, he saved the Union. He kept the United States from shattering into pieces. Second, he was the driving force behind ending slavery for good with the 13th Amendment. And maybe most importantly, through his leadership and his powerful words, he totally redefined what America was all about, this idea of a government for the people, dedicated to liberty and equality. In the end, Lincoln's goal was a just and lasting peace. His mission was to bind up the nation's wounds. And that leaves us with a pretty heavy question, one that's just as relevant today as it was over 150 years ago. Is that work really finished?